They thought they were just two women to push around, two faces to humiliate, two bodies to control. But what these drunk off-duty cops didn't know was that the women they were threatening were federal agents. By the time the sun rose the next morning, reputations would be shattered, careers would be ended, and a small-town police department would face its biggest scandal in decades. This is the story of the Carter twins and the night that changed everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. It started like any other Friday night. Lisa and Tina Carter, identical twin sisters, stepped into O'Hara's bar in the little town of Millfield, Georgia, laughing and hoping for a quiet drink after a long week of work. The place smelled of spilled beer, sticky floors, the kind of worn wood that had seen decades of Friday crowds, birthdays, good times. They ordered 2 cocktails, sat near the live music stage, and for a moment settled into the kind of ease that comes from years of trust and sibling rhythm, and from serving their country in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But by the time the band took their second break, the laughter in their corner had changed. 3 off-duty police officers, stormy, aggressive, and drunk, zeroed in on the sisters like sharks circling a wounded fish, making crude comments, stepping too close, using their badge power as blunt tools of intimidation. Tina told Lisa quietly, "Keep calm. We're still on visibility." Lisa nodded, pulse quickening, but the aura of control they projected hid years of training and survival. The bartender, Mario, watched nervously from behind the tap, and the crowd around the table shifted uneasily, the music fading into background hum. When one officer stumbled across their table, spilling a drink and grinning, Lisa said in a clear, low voice, "Back off." The man sneered, leaned in, the smell of whiskey heavy, and said, "Or what, princess, you gonna make me?" At that moment, Tina reached lightly for her badge case under her jacket, not yet revealing the truth. The air in the bar cooled. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a power test. The twins, former agents used to covert operations, stood still. Yet inside, dominoes were aligning for what would become a reckoning. Who were Danielle and Dominique Carter, really? Why were they in that bar that night? And how did a simple night out turn into an explosive confrontation that would shake an entire police department to its core? The Carter twins had built their lives on discipline, loyalty, and the quiet strength that comes from serving in silence. To most people, they were just 2 ordinary women, sisters who worked government jobs, who kept to themselves, who carried their pain and their pride with equal grace. But behind their calm smiles lay years of experience in undercover operations, long nights spent gathering intelligence, and the kind of courage that can only come from seeing the darker corners of human behavior up close. They had seen corruption before. They had exposed it. They had survived it. But never had it come this close to home. That night at Miller's Tavern, a place that called itself friendly, familiar, and safe, would test not only their training, but their belief in justice itself. How did it all begin? Was it just bad timing, or something more deliberate? Why were 3 local police officers, men who had sworn to protect and serve, so determined to humiliate 2 women they didn't even know? Were they drunk and reckless? Or was there something else behind their aggression? Something that hinted at deeper rot within their ranks? Tonight, we'll uncover how 3 officers crossed a line and how the women they underestimated brought about their downfall. It's a story of power abused, courage revealed, and a small southern town forced to face its own reflection in the harsh light of truth. Every witness would tell a slightly different version. Some claimed the men were just joking around. Others said it was more than that the laughter wasn't harmless, that something in the air turned mean. But the one thing no one could deny was this: the Carter twins never raised their voices, never backed away, and never forgot who they were. And when the truth came out, when the footage surfaced and the headlines broke, it wouldn't just be about one night at a bar. It would become a national conversation about power, race, and the invisible line between authority and abuse. Danielle and Dominique Carter grew up in the heart of Detroit, Michigan, in a modest brick house that shook every time the city buses rolled by. Their father, Raymond Carter, was a police officer, old school, stern, but fair. He wore his badge with pride, believing deeply that justice wasn't just a word written on courthouse walls. It was something you lived by, every single day. From a young age, the twins watched him lace up his boots, kiss their mother goodbye, and head into a world that didn't always welcome him. He was a black man in a blue uniform, navigating a system that wasn't built to protect men like him. Yet he did it anyway, because he believed change had to start from the inside. He used to tell them, "You can't fix a broken house by standing outside. You've got to walk in, even if the roof's caving in." Danielle, the older by 2 minutes, took those words to heart. She grew into the quiet strategist, the one who thought before she spoke, who could read a person's intentions with a single glance. Dominique, on the other hand, carried her father's fire. She was outspoken, fearless, and the kind of woman who believed that silence in the face of injustice was its own kind of crime. They balanced each other perfectly, one the calm, the other the storm. But everything changed the day their father didn't come home. He'd been investigating internal corruption within his department, missing funds, falsified reports, and officers selling confiscated drugs back onto the street. The morning they found him dead in his car, the official story said suicide. But both Danielle and Dominique knew better. Their father had been silenced. It was that loss that pushed them toward the bureau. They didn't join for glory or power. They joined for redemption, to finish what he started, to make sure no other family had to bury a good man because the wrong people wore the badge. Years later, after grueling training and years in the field, the Carter sisters had become 2 of the FBI's most disciplined agents. Danielle specialized in behavioral analysis, profiling patterns of misconduct within law enforcement agencies. Dominique focused on field operations, undercover work that exposed abuse of power and organized corruption rings. They had learned to operate under the radar, never revealing who they were, blending in wherever they went, which made their assignment in Georgia almost routine, or so they thought. It was supposed to be a quiet few weeks in a small town called Millfield, assisting local officers with federal compliance training. No field missions, no danger, just paperwork, observation, and mentoring. By Friday night, after long hours buried in reports, the twins decided to take a break. They found a small bar on the edge of town, Miller's Tavern, known for its live music and southern charm. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where strangers stood out the second they walked in. As they stepped inside, conversations softened just slightly. Eyes turned, a few smiles, a few stares that lingered too long. Danielle caught it first, the polite curiosity that small towns often showed outsiders, but beneath it, a trace of something colder. Still, they sat down near the stage, ordered drinks, and tried to blend into the rhythm of the evening. The band played old country hits, couples danced, and laughter filled the air. For a moment, it felt almost normal, almost safe. But not everyone was there for the music. In the far corner, 3 men sat together, uniforms hanging loosely over the backs of their chairs. Their badges glinted in the low light, half hidden beneath beer bottles. The bartender, an older man named Rick, leaned in as he served the twins their drinks. His voice dropped low enough for only them to hear. "Those guys in the corner," he said, nodding discreetly. "Off-duty cops. Best to ignore them." Danielle gave a polite smile. "Thanks for the heads up." Dominique chuckled lightly, brushing it off. "We'll be fine," she said. "We always are." Rick hesitated, then walked away. The twins didn't know it yet, but that quiet warning would be the last act of kindness they'd receive that night. Every sound in the bar, clinking glasses, guitar strings, bursts of laughter, was part of a calm that would soon fracture. The men in the corner started watching them, whispering, nudging one another. To the rest of the bar, it might have looked like harmless interest. But to the Carters, trained observers of human behavior, it was a pattern they'd seen before. A look that always came before trouble. They didn't want to cause a scene. They just wanted one peaceful evening. But fate had already made its decision. That night, in that small-town bar, Danielle and Dominique Carter would face the same corruption their father died fighting. Only this time they wouldn't be the ones backing down. The night had grown heavier, the laughter sharper, the air thick with whiskey and ego. In the far corner, the three off-duty officers, Sergeant Rick Dalton, Mark Stevens, and rookie Kyle Boyd, had already gone through several rounds. Dalton, the oldest of the three, was the kind of man who wore authority like armor. Years on the force had given him a swagger that crossed easily into arrogance. Mark Stevens, his longtime partner, was quieter but crueler in his humor, a man who followed Dalton's lead without question. And Kyle Boyd, barely 24, was new to the badge, eager to prove himself, and still foolish enough to think Dalton's approval meant respect. Together, they were a dangerous trio, men who blurred the line between brotherhood and power, between camaraderie and control. When they first noticed the Carter twins, it wasn't admiration that crossed their faces. It was entitlement. Dalton leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Well, would you look at that?" he said, nudging Stevens. "Two pretty faces sitting all alone. Don't see that too often around here." Stevens chuckled. "City types, maybe. Look at the way they're dressed. Don't fit in here at all." The rookie grinned nervously, trying to match their tone. "Think they're new in town?" Dalton's eyes narrowed as he studied the sisters. "Let's go find out." They rose from their seats with the kind of lazy confidence that comes from years of getting away with things they shouldn't. As they approached, Danielle noticed them first, her gaze flicking up from her glass. Calm, unbothered, but alert. Dominique followed her sister's glance and exhaled softly, bracing herself. "Evening, ladies," Dalton said, his words slurred but loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "You two from out of town?" Danielle gave a polite, measured smile. "Just visiting." "Visiting, huh?" Stephen said, stepping closer. "That's a lot of attitude for two girls drinking alone." His tone wasn't playful. It was a warning, wrapped in mockery. Dominique straightened her back, meeting his eyes without flinching. "We're fine right here," she said, her voice calm but firm. The rookie, unsure of what to do, laughed awkwardly. "Hey, don't be like that. We're just being friendly." Dalton tilted his head, scanning them with a predator's ease. "Friendly?" he echoed. "Right. Maybe you should show a little gratitude, sweetheart. We're local law enforcement." The room seemed to shrink. A few people at the bar glanced over but quickly looked away. Bartender Luis wiped the counter, pretending not to see, his jaw tight. He'd worked there long enough to know when trouble was coming, and this had all the signs. Danielle's hand rested gently on the edge of the table. "We appreciate that," she said evenly. "Now if you'll excuse us, we'd like to finish our drinks." Dalton smirked, leaning in just enough to make it uncomfortable. Now, don't be like that. We're just trying to make sure you ladies feel welcome." Stevens laughed, the kind of laugh that made the skin crawl. "Yeah, no reason to be shy. It's just us." Dominique's patience cracked slightly. "I said we're fine," she repeated more firmly this time. Dalton's smile vanished. "Watch your tone," he said quietly. "You might not know who you're talking to." A tense silence filled the air. The music from the jukebox kept playing, but it felt distant now, irrelevant. Dominique exchanged a glance with Danielle, a look that said everything. "Stay calm. Control the situation." Danielle nodded subtly. But the officers weren't done. Mark Stevens leaned on the edge of their table, knocking over a napkin holder. "Come on, don't ruin the fun," he said. "We're just being neighborly." Danielle's voice stayed measured but colder now. "We said no. Walk away." Dalton took a step closer, his breath heavy with alcohol, and placed his hand on Dominique's shoulder. That single gesture, the crossing of an invisible line, changed everything. Danielle's tone shifted from polite to commanding. "Take your hand off my sister." For a moment there was a pause, a flicker of surprise in Dalton's eyes that this woman dared to talk to him that way. Then came the sneer. "You think you're in charge here?" he said, tightening his grip. Dominique's hand twitched toward her jacket, the reflex of years of training suppressed by restraint. Every second stretched thin. The bartender's hand hovered near the phone beneath the counter. One wrong move and it would all explode. Dalton chuckled darkly, turning to the rookie. "See that, Boyd? That's what's wrong with people these days. No respect." The rookie looked uneasy now, his eyes darting around the room. "Maybe we should just—" "Quiet," Dalton snapped. "We're teaching a lesson here." But the lesson would not go as planned. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that these weren't two helpless women. They were federal agents, trained to read danger, to stay calm under fire. Danielle's eyes met her sister's again, and in that silent exchange lay an entire history of discipline and control. And then, something shifted. Dalton's hand moved lower, an intentional challenge. Dominique stood abruptly, knocking her chair back. "I said, take your hand off me." Her voice rang through the room, sharp enough to silence the music. Every conversation in the bar stopped. Dalton laughed, raising both hands mockingly. "Whoa, calm down, sweetheart. No need to get all feisty." But Danielle saw it now, the bulge under his jacket. A gun. Not locked away, not stored. On him. And he wasn't the only one. Stevens's badge caught the light as he shifted, and she realized all three of them were armed, drunk, angry, and carrying weapons. Her pulse steadied, not out of fear, but calculation. They weren't just drunk, the narrator says, the tone darkening. They were armed, and within seconds the situation would spiral out of control. The night outside Miller's Tavern was chaos. Red and blue lights flashed against broken glass scattered across the parking lot. The air was thick with shouting, sirens, and disbelief. A phone lay face down on the ground, its screen cracked but still recording. Paramedics rushed to help the injured while uniformed officers tried to piece together what had just happened. Danielle and Dominique Carter stood side by side, bruised but calm, their faces illuminated by the harsh glare of police lights. They had come to unwind after a long week of training. Now they were at the center of a national scandal. By morning, the footage from that phone had gone viral. What started as a tense bar altercation in the quiet town of Briarwood had erupted into something far bigger. The video showed everything: the laughter, the mocking, the shove, and finally, the moment when Sergeant Rick Dalton reached for his weapon. The internet caught fire overnight. Hashtags like the Carter Sisters and our Justice in Briarwood trended across every major platform. News outlets replayed the same 30-second clip over and over again, dissecting every movement, every word, every look on the officers' faces. The headlines were relentless. FBI agents harassed by off-duty cops. Small-town department under federal investigation. Carter twins demand accountability. What no one knew yet was who these women truly were. To the world, they were simply two victims. But inside the FBI, they were something more. Highly trained agents, daughters of a Detroit police officer who had died trying to expose corruption in his own department. In Washington, the video played on repeat inside a dimly lit conference room. A group of senior agents watched in silence, their expressions tight. When the footage ended, the bureau director leaned forward and spoke quietly. "These are our agents?" His tone wasn't angry. It was controlled. Too controlled. Everyone in that room knew what came next. The bureau couldn't ignore it. A formal investigation began immediately. Meanwhile, back in Briarwood, the local police department scrambled to control the damage. Sergeant Rick Dalton's report disappeared from the system. Surveillance footage from the bar's cameras was mysteriously erased. Witness statements were rewritten. The sheriff called it an unfortunate misunderstanding, but the truth was slipping through his fingers. What no one counted on was Luis, the bartender. He had been behind the counter that entire night, phone in hand, pretending to scroll while secretly recording. He wasn't a man who liked attention, but what he saw that night haunted him. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the fear on Dominique's face when the gun appeared, the steady calm in Danielle's voice when she warned the men to back away. He knew what was right. He uploaded the entire uncut footage, the threats, the laughter, the assault, to the FBI tip line and hit send. When the Bureau received it, everything changed. The footage was longer than the viral clip. It revealed the truth, that the Carter sisters had identified themselves as federal agents multiple times before things turned violent. It showed the officers mocking them, cornering them, and one of them drunkenly reaching for his weapon. The cover-up collapsed in an instant. Federal investigators descended on Briarwood, seizing records, interviewing witnesses, and confronting the local sheriff. The story exploded nationwide. News vans lined the streets outside the police department. Journalists dug into the pasts of Dalton, Stevens, and Boyd, and what they found made the scandal even darker. There were prior complaints of misconduct, unfiled reports, and cases that had mysteriously vanished. The Carter sisters' confrontation had exposed more than one night of drunken violence. It had pulled the curtain back on a culture of silence that stretched years deep. Luis became an unexpected hero. Though terrified, he stood by his account, confirming every second of his video. His footage forced the sheriff's department to suspend the 3 officers involved, pending a federal review. And for the first time, the people of Briarwood began to ask questions about the men who had worn badges in their town for decades. For Danielle and Dominique, the investigation wasn't about revenge. It was about something deeper, continuing the mission their father had died for. The same corruption that had cost him his life had now surfaced again, hundreds of miles away. This time, though, they weren't going to lose. But as the investigation deepened, the sisters began to realize this wasn't the first time those officers had done something like this. And they weren't the only ones who'd been silenced. Something bigger was hiding beneath the surface. Something that would turn a small-town bar fight into a federal reckoning. The truth came out piece by piece like shards of glass catching light. The FBI's internal investigation uncovered audio from that night. Clean, undeniable sound from Luis's recording. In the middle of the chaos, Danielle's voice could be heard clearly, calm but firm. "We are federal agents, stand down." There was no mistaking her tone. It wasn't a threat. It was a command. But the laughter that followed was chilling. Sergeant Rick Dalton's voice, slurred and mocking, cut through the background noise. "Federal agents? Yeah, sure you are." Then came the shove, the fall of a chair, the crack of something breaking. The moment before everything turned violent was frozen forever on that tape. When the audio was released to federal authorities, everything changed. Within hours, unmarked SUVs pulled into the Briarwood Police Department parking lot. Men and women in suits stepped out. Internal Affairs, the Department of Justice, and the FBI's own Office of Professional Responsibility. The same department that once tried to hide the truth now stood surrounded by those who demanded it. Officers who had spent years feeling untouchable were suddenly being questioned under oath. Inside, tension filled every corner. Files were seized, body cam data pulled, and statements collected. What was once a cover-up now became a federal operation. The sheriff, who had publicly downplayed the incident, found himself under scrutiny for obstruction. Reporters crowded the lobby, shouting questions no one wanted to answer. Did your men know they were FBI agents? Why was the footage deleted? Who ordered the report to be altered? For Danielle and Dominique, it was a strange twist of fate. Less than 2 days earlier, they had been treated as victims, 2 women cornered and humiliated by men who thought they could get away with it. Now they were the reason an entire department was being dismantled. The power had shifted completely. The men who once mocked them were now facing suspension, public disgrace, and possible federal charges. But behind the public storm, a quieter struggle unfolded. Dominique couldn't sleep. The replay of that night haunted her. She admitted to her sister one evening, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to fight back. I wanted to hit him. But I couldn't lose control, not with everyone watching." Danielle looked at her and said softly, "You didn't lose control. You gave them enough rope to hang themselves." That line stayed with her, because she knew her sister was right. By staying calm, by refusing to stoop to violence, they had exposed something much larger than one night's injustice. They had exposed a culture of abuse that thrived on intimidation. Their restraint had become their weapon, and it hit harder than any punch ever could. As federal authorities began compiling their final report, shocking new details emerged. Dalton, Stevens, and Boyd weren't just three reckless cops. They had prior complaints filed against them, all mysteriously dismissed. 2 years earlier, a young woman had accused Dalton of excessive force outside the same bar, but her case had vanished before it reached court. A witness later claimed he was threatened into silence. It was clear that what happened to the Carter sisters wasn't random. It was a pattern, and this time, it had been caught on camera. The revelation ignited nationwide outrage. Editorials demanded reform. Talk shows debated accountability in law enforcement. And for the first time in a long time, people weren't just angry, they were listening. The Carter sisters became symbols of controlled strength in the face of injustice. They didn't fight fire with fire. They fought it with truth. And for those who had laughed that night thinking the flashing badges were fake, the laughter had stopped. The same hands that once reached for their guns were now signing legal documents, confessing, apologizing, resigning. The balance of power had shifted, and there was no going back. The courtroom was silent except for the soft clicks of cameras and the shuffling of papers. The once proud officers now sat in identical gray suits, heads lowered, avoiding the gaze of the two women they had underestimated. Danielle and Dominique Carter sat side by side in the front row, their posture straight, their expressions calm. They had faced worse before: loss, corruption, betrayal. But this moment carried a different weight. They weren't just witnesses, they were proof that justice, no matter how delayed, could still arrive. When the verdicts were read, there were no cheers, just a deep collective exhale that seemed to lift the tension that had gripped the town for months. All three officers, Sergeant Rick Dalton, Mark Stevens, and Kyle Boyd, pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations and assault. Dalton lost his pension and was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Stevens and Boyd received lesser sentences, but both were permanently barred from law enforcement. The department's chief resigned just days later, citing loss of public trust. Outside, reporters crowded the courthouse steps, capturing every word, every reaction. For the Carter sisters, it wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. The same system that once protected men like Dalton had finally held them responsible. Across the country, news anchors replayed their story, calling it a turning point in small-town policing and federal oversight. But for the sisters, it was simpler than that. It was the closure their father never got to see. A few weeks later, the town of Briarwood changed. Miller's Tavern, the bar where everything had started, closed permanently. Its owner said he couldn't bear to reopen after what had happened. In its place, the community center hosted a memorial event honoring those who stood up for justice. Luis, the bartender who had risked everything to release the footage, was presented with a community service award. His hands trembled as he accepted it, tears forming as the audience stood in applause. He didn't think of himself as a hero, but without him, the truth might have died in silence. On a gray morning months later, Danielle and Dominique stood at their father's grave in Detroit. The air was crisp, the kind that carries quiet memories. They placed a small badge-shaped plaque beside his tombstone, engraved with the words, "Integrity is the highest form of courage," the same phrase he used to tell them when they were children. Danielle brushed a leaf from the stone, whispering, "We did it, Daddy." Dominique looked out across the cemetery, her voice steady but soft. "He taught us to serve with honor. That night we finally did." For a long moment they stood in silence, letting the weight of everything sink in. The pain, the anger, the victory. Their father had died trying to expose corruption. They had lived long enough to dismantle it, one act of truth at a time. As they turned to leave, the city skyline shimmered faintly in the distance. The world wasn't fixed. It never would be. But for once, justice had chosen the right side. And sometimes, that's all it takes. One night, 2 women, and a promise kept to a man who believed in something greater than fear. The story of Danielle and Dominique Carter spread far beyond Briarwood. It became a symbol of grace under pressure, of strength without rage, of justice earned through restraint. Across online forums and living rooms, people debated what they would have done in the same situation. Some said they would have fought back immediately. Others admitted they might have lost control. But what made the Carter sisters remarkable wasn't just that they survived. It was how they did it. They chose discipline over fury, truth over chaos, and in doing so, exposed everything their father had warned them about. Their story left people asking themselves difficult questions. What would I have done if I were in their place? Would I have stayed calm when faced with that kind of disrespect? Or would I have snapped, like anyone else might? The sisters' courage forced everyone watching to confront their own idea of justice, not just in theory, but in the heat of the moment. And as their story came to a close, one message echoed through every comment section, every news panel, every conversation around dinner tables across America: that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it looks like 2 women standing firm in the face of arrogance, refusing to let anger define them. If this story moved you, share what you think below. What would you have done that night? Would you have stayed calm or fought back? And if you thought what happened to the Carter sisters was shocking, wait until you hear what happened when a billionaire tested his maid, and her reaction left him speechless.